I have a Minolta MD 50mm f1.4 lens here that I'm going to be fully disassembling. Externally, this lens is quite similar to the 1.7 and the 1.2 of the MD non-Rocker X versions of the 50mm lenses. But internally, it actually uses a few construction techniques that are more similar to the Rocker X MD 1.4, which is the lens I have right here. So these two lenses are a little bit more similar internally in how they're constructed, even though externally they look a lot different. I'm going to be fully taking this lens apart, getting access to the diaphragm, optics, and other components on their own as much as possible, and I'm also going to be taking apart the diaphragm to be able to clean the individual blades on this copy. This lens does use some of the cheaper construction techniques as the later regular MD lenses, but it is a little bit easier to repair in some respects, but it's still not great compared to the earlier MC lenses. First off, I'm going to start by getting access to the front of the diaphragm blades by going in through the front of the lens here and removing the name ring first. Like on the 1.7 and the 2, there are no slots for a spanning wrench on this, so you either have to, on this copy I've already loosened up a bit, so it should, let's see here. Oftentimes you'll be able to just grab the sides here and unscrew this, but I'm having a little trouble here, so I'm going to use a piece of pipe, and then I have rolls of gaffer's tape on the end, and this will just give me a little bit more traction to go in here and loosen that up to start off with, and now I can unscrew it. Alright, and next up I'm going to remove the ring that's going around up here, which holds the filters and that the name ring we're screwing into, this black ring. And it is just screwed in place, but there are these two little slotted screws down here that kind of lock it in position. So I have to loosen these up a little bit and then I can unscrew it. So I'll loosen these up. Now I should be able to focus out here. Just grab this and unscrew that. Now I have the front optical piece exposed here. And I'm just going to remove this front optical piece by removing these three screws going around here on the upper section. And much like on the 1.7 and the 2, this front optical piece at least is fully encased in plastic. So you can clean the external surfaces, but you really can't clean inside of here, to my knowledge, because there's no way to actually undo the individual elements of this piece. So I'll set that aside. Now we also have access to the front of the diaphragm blades. So you can try cleaning it off in this state, but now I'm going to flip this over and get access to the back of the diaphragm blades as well. Looking at the back of the lens, you can see that the back optical element's much larger than on the 1.7 or the 2, and it has little slots for a spanning wrench here and here that you could try to undo in its current state. But I find that it's a little bit more difficult than just removing the entire mounting plate and then removing the back optical piece. So I'm going to remove the mounting plate by taking off the 4 screws going around here. Just lift off the entire back mounting plate assembly. Alright, and now I can just grab this. And the mounting plate assembly on this lens is fairly similar to the 1.7. A few little differences. It has all the coupling for the stop-down lever and the aperture control back here, and then I'll talk more about that on the reassembly. But it's overall very similar to the 1.7 or the 2 on that piece. Now I have access to the back of the lens here, the back optical piece, and now to get access to the back of the diaphragm blades, I can just go in here and grab the back optical piece or use a spanning wrench in the two little divots here and here if it's really stuck. But most of the time you can just grab that and unscrew this. And one of the nice things about the back optical piece is that it's more like the MC lenses, where if you look closely at it, there's 2 slots for the spanning wrenches. There's one here on the inside and then one on the outside. And this actually allows you to undo one of the elements here and undo the inner elements and clean inside the back optical piece, whereas the 1.7 and the 2 had the same sort of encased in plastic back optical piece as the front optical piece of this lens has. Now I have access to the back of the diaphragm blades as well. And unfortunately on this lens, it is like the 1.7 and the 2, where the diaphragm itself is housed inside the inner part of the focusing mechanism. So really removing the focusing mechanism, to actually clean the diaphragm and get it on its own, you have to remove the inner section of the focusing mechanism, and that's all covered in oil, lubricating the focusing action. So it's really a little bit harder to clean, and this is probably the best state to clean it in because you have access to the back here and the front here. I'm actually going to, for this disassembly, both get the housing here out of the lens, so get the diaphragm housing out of the lens with the inner part of the focusing mechanism, and then also remove the individual blades later on. Looking back at the back of the lens here, I have the aperture control ring going around on the outside here with the aperture control curve over here, and as it rotates back and forth, it makes the clicking sound and kind of locks in the different stops. Because there's a little ball bearing over here that's going against some grooves. So this just slides off, but I have to be careful not to lose the ball bearing. So there's the ball bearing, there's the aperture control ring. Now, before I continue on with the back disassembly, I'm just going to flip over to the front and remove the focusing ring so that it can be cleaned on its own. Once you remove the focusing ring, you don't really have to do this step, but once you do remove the focusing ring, you have to zero the lens back to infinity. What this allows you to do is clean the ring on its own. So if it has a lot of debris or things in the rubber grip or actually in the numbers here, you can clean that out much better. So the focusing ring is attached down on this silver washer hidden here in this section next to the inner part of the focusing mechanism by 3 screws going around here, and I'll just undo these 3 and then lift off the silver washer and the focusing ring. Alright, so there's the focusing ring and there's the silver washer that all the screws were sitting in. So this can be cleaned on its own now. And now I have access to the inner parts of the focusing mechanism a little bit better. I'll flip this back over to continue on with the disassembly. What I want to do here is remove this black section of the focusing mechanism, which is what's housing the diaphragm, from the outer part of the focusing mechanism, which contains this silver part here and the lens body section here. These two are kind of coupled together. So I'm going to remove the black section here and the diaphragm housing, inner part of the focusing mechanism. And the inner part of the focusing mechanism, it moves up and down as I focus in and out by turning this silver ring, kind of simulating moving the focusing ring. And the way it locks, the way that it's being locked in place so that it moves up and down instead of just spinning around is this little track and bar over here on the intersection of the focusing mechanism. So these 2 screws hold this little metal piece in place and it moves along this track. So I'm just going to focus out here, and while it's at this extreme focused out, I'm going to undo these 2 screws in here and just remove that little metal piece as well. Alright, and now with that piece removed, I can focus the lens out past where it could go before. So I'll grab just the black section here and keep these other 2 sections, the silver section and the black body piece, fixed and focus this out. And once it gets to the point where it actually falls out, I'm going to keep it in its current position and just lightly mark somewhere on here where it fell out of the inner part. So I'm going to mark over by the numbers over here. That's where it fell out. And now I have these 2 pieces separate. And this piece is as far taken apart as I could find how to get this one, the body section here and the outer part of the focusing mechanism. And we also have the inner part of the focusing mechanism, which is also the diaphragm housing in here. I'm going to take the disassembly one step further than I did on the 1.7 and the 2 by actually disassembling the diaphragm on this particular lens. So here I have the diaphragm, inner part of the diaphragm, and I'm going to actually get access to the individual aperture blades. But before I do that, let me just quickly show how this is working. The lever back here is what's controlling the diaphragm, the back of the lens, and that's being held open by this spring over here, which is the wire. So there's a little copper wire that holds this open, and that's attached over here. And then when I flip this over, it's all the coils in here are all covered in grease, so it's a little bit hard to handle. But on the front section here, we have the 6 blades going around, all locking in place. But on the front section, we have 3 screws or 2 screws in here that are holding on this top plate, and that top plate is holding the blades in place. There's another plate behind that holds the back of the blades in place, and that's what the little lever back here is attaching to. So I'm going to undo all those and get the blades out on their own. So first I'm going to undo these 2 screws and remove this metal kind of half washer thing, which is I believe in a little groove down there. So let me get these screws out first. Now I'll remove the little metal piece down here. Okay, so got that retaining ring. And just holding in the front plate here. I should have done this probably before, but I'm going to unhook the back section here, the spring, on this lens, on this wire here. So I'm going to unhook the spring by just lifting it up off the post back here. There we go. And now I'm going to just lift off this top plate here, and all the blades will fall out at this point, which is what I'm expecting. And there's the blades, and there's the back section of the plate, and front section of the plate. So I'm going to move these blades off so they don't get too much grease on them during this whole process. And I'm also going to use little tweezers to handle them instead of handling them directly, because even just fingerprints will leave marks on them that you will then have to clean off. And in this case, they were already clean, so I don't really want to clean them off again. And especially because of the inner part of the diaphragm being housed inside the focusing mechanism with all the lubricant and stuff for the focusing, it's really easy to get oil and other stuff onto the blades while you're taking this apart. So that has the disassembly of the lens complete. Very similar in how it's constructed and the low number of components that it has to the 1.7 and the 2, but there are some important differences in it. Got things like the optics here, with the back optic that can actually be taken apart and cleaned on more than just the front and back surfaces, separate from the body sections, focusing ring, aperture control ring down here, and the mechanical parts like the diaphragm, which is all taken apart, so the blades and the whole diaphragm assembly and the focusing mechanism. So these can all be cleaned pretty much on their own without as much risk as damaging different components here, and you can make repairs as needed as well. I'm going to start with the reassembly now. This is probably the most challenging part of the reassembly, and it's usually not necessary to take apart the diaphragm like I did unless it needs serious cleaning. It allows you to clean the blades a lot better than you can do inside the lens, because while they're inside the lens you can't really press down on them because they're so thin that they'll easily bend or be deformed, whereas outside the lens you can put them on a flat surface and clean them a whole lot better, and actually submerge them in a cleaning solution and do other things. So it's a lot better to clean them, but it's usually not necessary. For most oil and stuff on the blades, you can clean it inside the lens. So the way that this is going to work is we have the 2 plates here, front plate and back plate, and the back plate has all these little posts on it, 6 little posts. Front plate has these holes in it, and the post and the holes or slots should lock together like this, so that the front plate rotates back and forth. And the blades are going to go in so that, let me grab one of these blades. So the blades have a little slot over here, and then a little post over here. The little post is going to go inside on the front plate here, inside these slots, whereas the little slot on the blade is going to go onto the back plate like this, onto the little posts. And they're just going, all these blades have to be overlapped properly for the diaphragm to properly open and close. So I'm just going to grab the back diaphragm piece right here and start on the reassembly. You can attempt to do this reassembly inside the lens too. Just put the back diaphragm piece back into the lens, but because it's housed inside the inner part of the focusing mechanism, I found it's easier to do it outside because you can risk getting oil on it. So this post is going to make things a little bit more difficult. So let me just grab a lens cap to kind of make this flat so I can work better on this. Okay, and I'll start by just getting one of the blades here with the little slot on, or the post on the back section into the little slot on the blade. Uh-oh. So that it's going like that. There we go. I'll grab the next blade as well. And just set it on top of the next post so it's going on top of the previous blade I set. Okay, and I'm going to keep doing this for the next 3, I believe, and just keep overlapping them. Okay, and this last one's the only most challenging one here, I guess. The other ones were just sitting on top of each other, and this last one has to both sit on top of this previous one and then go underneath this first one. So it's easier to just get it sitting on top of this one first. So let me get that, and then I can be kind of rotated around to be underneath this other one as well. Uh-oh. So I lost the first one there. So I'm going to have to... Okay, so I'm going to try with this last one again. Sit it in place first. Now just gently move it over. And I'm going to hold this side down slightly so that it does not go out of this slot. All right, there we go. Now I'm going to be very careful moving this. And next up I have to get the top plate here back on top of all these little individual blades in here. And to make that easier, I'm going to get all these blades in the same relative position. So I'm going to get them all so that they're the blades are as far outwards on this circle as possible. So I'm just going to push them all in. And I'm also going to make sure that they're all going roughly around the circle of this piece as well. Okay, that looks good. Now I just need to lower this whole thing back onto here so that the little posts line up properly with the little posts on the blades going around there. And the little posts need to go on the blades themselves, go into the slots in here, or the little holes in here, and then the ones on the back of the ring, those posts go into these slots back here. So I'm going to get those lined up as best as possible. Okay. And at this point, there's nothing holding this back piece together, but if I just gently hold these two together, move the back section back and forth, the diaphragm should open and close. I'm just going to leave it in the open state because that's going to make reassembly a little bit easier. Now I have to get it back inside the inner part of the diaphragm mechanism here, which is also can be a bit of a challenge. In this one, I'm going to flip over the intersection of the diaphragm mechanism so I can look at it from the back, and I have to get this post up through this slot over here. But besides that, there's not much that has to really be lined up. So I'm going to grab the front section here and just position it correctly in my hand and just lower this other one on top of it. There we go. And I don't want to set it down actually at this point because the back post is still loose. So to lock this in place, I want to get this silver ring in place before I do anything else. This is just going to slide. There's a groove down in this diaphragm mechanism down here that this has to go into. So I'm going to bend this inwards and then push it down into that groove. Just make sure it's down all the way, all around this. All right, now it's a little bit safer to work with this piece. And you can see that it's not actually opening and closing properly at this stage. And that's caused by it being locked down in the wrong position. So I'm going to spin the intersection here, the black section. Right now it's at fully closed. I'm going to spin this around until it was about at the same position we started off at. And now it should also fully open when I hit this lever over here. And I'll hook back up the little spring mechanism by just getting this wire and just looping it back over the post back here. And pressing it down so it's going into the diaphragm mechanism again. Alright, so that looks good. Fully opens, closing the right amount. And I'll complete the reassembly of this diaphragm piece by just reattaching the two little screws here and here in the inner part of the diaphragm mechanism to just lock that silver ring back down. So make sure it fully opens, fully closes, and snaps to be fully closed in its default state. So I'll set all this aside. Now starting on the main reassembly again, I'm going to get the inner part of the diaphragm focusing mechanism back into the lens body. And when I took this apart, I had made little marks over by where the numbers were on this diaphragm mechanism. A little hard to see now. All right, so over here. So I'm going to just screw these two pieces back together. Go. And on the intersection here, when I took this apart, I had it as far focused out as possible. On the intersection of the focusing mechanism diaphragm piece, there's the little track right here, and then the two little spots where the focusing coupler between the intersection and the outer section was going. So this little metal piece, this guy. So I want that lined up with the track so that the track's in between these two screw holes. And now I'll get this piece back in place I'll get it started into the two screws outside of the lens. It'll be a little bit easier, or at least one of them. Just slide this down the track. Get that other one in place as well. Now I should be able to focus in and out. Now for the back, continuing on with the back reassembly, I'm going to get the aperture control ring back in place. So it has the aperture control curve on it, which is going to go into the little indentation between these two sections over here. It just slides in place, but I have to get the aperture control ball bearing in place as well. So it sits in the aperture control ring. There's a little pocket down here. And I'm just going to slide this entire thing over the lens so that the ball bearing's pressed up against the grooves over here. And when I'm sliding it over, I'll kind of press the ball bearing in so that it gets like that. And it should click when I turn it back and forth now. Now I'll reattach the back optical piece as well. So it just is going to screw in place. And now I want to get the aperture control, or the mounting plate, which has the coupling of the aperture control ring and the stop down lever into the lens body on it. So the actual coupling is taking place. This is the bar that controls the diaphragm and the aperture size. We're here. And it's coupled out to this piece in the mounting plate, this crescent-shaped metal piece over here, through this little pocket right here. So that hooks onto that bar. The stop-down lever on the back directly controls this little crescent-shaped piece. And the aperture control ring is controlling it through this post over here. This sits in front of the aperture control curve over here. And as the aperture control curve moves, it moves this post up and down, it opens and closes the aperture as well. So to line this up, I just have to get this post on the diaphragm control into that little pocket there. It should go flat. Then find the 4 screw holes going around here. And check and make sure it's actually working properly at this stage as well. And just reattach these two components together. What I want to check now is that when the lens is fully open, none of the blades are visible, which looks good. When it's fully closed, there's still an opening in the middle, but it's not very large, and that it has opening and closing at every stop along here. And that when I hit the stop down lever, it fully opens as well and springs back to being fully closed in its default state. And next up, I'm going to get the focusing ring back onto the lens body. Have the silver washer right here, actual focusing ring as well. And I'm just going to reattach this in any position for now. So I'm going to slide the silver washer into the top of the focusing ring, get that started. This is actually going to sit down on the lens so that the numbers over here on the focusing ring are going back and forth with the little indicator that's indicating the focus. It should kind of, even not being attached, it should stop at infinity and at 0.45, the minimum focusing distance, because there's a little notch on the focusing ring that actually limits how far you can focus in either direction. So let me get that lined up. And just remove that for a second. And now to reattach this, I have to use 3 little screws in the washer here, the silver washer, that go down into the silver section in here, into these 3 little sections down there. So I'll get those started. And at this stage, this is where you can zero the lens back to infinity. I've just kind of locked it down at an arbitrary position in here, which is not correct, but to zero the lens back to infinity, the problem right now is that the focusing ring here does not indicate the actual proper focus, how it's optically focused. So to zero it back to infinity, you have the lens optically all constructed at this point. So you can mount it on the camera in its current state. And with the focusing ring exposed like this, you can spin it around so that it's optically focused at infinity. Mine's kind of in the wrong position completely, so it's not even focusing. It's close to infinity, so it's not even focusing past the 0.5 over here. So that's indicating that I'm close to infinity already. But what you can do is you would spin this around until it's optically focused to infinity, and you may have to loosen up the 3 screws in here, spin the focusing ring around, and then tighten it back down, and then keep focusing until it's to infinity. So I can just simulate that. I'll loosen these up a little bit. So I'll say that that's where the lens is optically focused at infinity now, in this current state, or I'll just lock this down, and now focusing it back and forth. Here's where it's optically focused at infinity. And now at this setting where it's optically focused at infinity, I would loosen up the focusing ring again so that I can move it independently of the optical focusing and just spin it around until it's at infinity as well. And then just tighten these all back down. And that will optically focus the lens back to infinity. So that the focusing ring is set properly as well. When it's optically set at infinity, it will read infinity. And you want to look and make sure it can go through the entire range from the minimum focusing distance to the maximum focusing distance, and has a kind of a click when you hit the 2 extremes, which is indicating that it's not being stopped early and that the indicator on the focusing ring is actually hitting what it's supposed to. Now I'll reattach the filter ring holder here, which just screws in place into the section down here. It's a little easier if I focus to the minimum focusing distance. Screw this in place, and this is locked down by the 2 little set screws in here. And finally, to complete the reassembly, I'll put the name ring back in place. It's a little hard on this one because it's so thin, so it's easy to get fingerprints on the glass. Alright, so that has the reassembly of this lens all complete. Overall, it's pretty similar to the 1.7 and the 2 version of the regular MD lenses. So it does use the cheaper plastic materials and the cheaper construction techniques. A lot of annoyances like the diaphragm being integrated into the inner part of the focusing mechanism, but it's fairly easy to take apart and get some basic repairs done on it. And it's a little bit slightly more repairable than the 1.7 and 2. It's still not as repairable as the MC lenses because it does have these plastic encased optics and other components, but it's a little bit better than the 1.7 in that you can clean inside the back optics at least. So if you feel confident taking apart the 1.7 or the 2 version of this 50mm lens, taking apart the 1.4 and repairing that one as well probably isn't too much of a challenge.